I'm Lori Robinson with Johnson County Historical Society. Okay. This is Sunday Antrim, and she's one of Johnson County's Master Gardeners and one of the 4 chairpersons of the tell it to me. Taste of the Heritage Garden. Okay, at Plum Grove. Okay, and she's going to tell us about some of the things that went into planning this wonderful event.
Hello. Well, we started in March, and one of the first things we did was send publicity to all of the papers and then into the calendars in the area. At that time, the Master Gardeners, we spread the news to them that we would be having this event again this year, and made up a menu that we would like to serve, and then started asking members to be cooks and try some of the recipes. And the recipes are heritage recipes. We did research them at the University Library in the Rare Books Room. Most of them are from Central Iowa, and they date from about 87 to probably 1937. Things got a little busy in the last couple days as we were wondering about the weather and different things like that.
We were lucky with the weather. So you said you were researching the heritage recipes. I'm wondering if you used the huge cookbook collection that the University of Iowa Library had.
Yes, we did. The Zathmary collection at the university is what we used, yes.
I bet that was really fascinating. Thank you very much. And would you say your name and your city and tell us about the food you made? I know you're a master gardener.
Casey Jurgensen from right here in River City, Johnson County, actually. I did make the squash soup for tonight's gala. The squash soup has a mixture of spices from nutmeg, white pepper, cinnamon, mix that with pumpkin and chicken stock, add cream, and it's the best soup I've ever had.
That sounds wonderful. Are you serving it cold or hot?
It is hot. We try to do things that maybe the Mrs. would have had here at Plum Grove in her era.
That's a really neat idea. Is it an old recipe then?
Actually, this isn't, but there are old recipes out there. This is kind of I suppose, a 80s, 90s version with the combination of cinnamons and black pepper. It's not a normal combination.
Yeah, it's pretty spicy. Those spices might have not all been available to Friendly Lucas 150 years ago. Well, it sounds like a wonderful soup.
I'm Jim Ridenauer. I live in Iowa City. I have my own vegetable garden at home. I was not involved with the growing of this garden, and quite honestly, this evening has been a learning experience for me. But these represent crops that were grown prior to 1850, so some varieties that you don't see anymore. And so it's quite fascinating, especially the tomato plants you see here. Represent a couple of older varieties that are just growing to enormous heights. And what we have is a combination of vegetables and herbs here. And of course, they were planted earlier. And again, it's fascinating to see some of the items like the one behind there, that amaranth is actually a vegetable. And the ends, the flower part, are cut off, dried, and then ground up as flour. So that's certainly something I didn't know before this evening.
I've heard of amaranth flour. I think seen it in the health food store. Isn't it more nutritious than regular white flour?
It could be. Like I said, I've just been introduced to it for the first time tonight.
It's a beautiful plant anyway.
Beautiful. That's probably why it's popular to grow. And then this is rainbow chard, which is, you can see the leaves right there. So.
And chard's a cabbage-like plant, isn't it? Or do you eat the leaves of that, or is there a root thing?
Yes, it should be the leaves. I've never personally grown chard, just leaf lettuce, but yes, I think that's what you would eat would be the leaves, right?
Would you tell us why you're here at the Plum Grove Heritage Garden tasting?
Oh, I wouldn't miss it. This is the third time I've been here, and it's just really, really a treat. I really enjoy it, and think it's just a great community event.
This is only the third time we've had it, so you must have been here every single year.
Yes, yep, I wouldn't miss it. It's always on my calendar, and everybody does so much work for it, and it's just a nice way to spend an afternoon.
Did you have anything to eat yet?
Not yet. I tried some of the tea, and so I just haven't gotten over there to get anything to eat. So
You better hurry. They're only serving the first 300. Thank you for coming. Did you notice all the trees that are missing?
yes, yeah, it's sad, but in a way, it gives a little bit more light to the area. So
It's a little cleaner.
yeah, yeah. So,
Thank you for coming.
you're welcome.
This is Betty Kelly, and she's one of the early master gardeners, which makes you sound primitive and primeval, and that's not what I meant you to sound like. But I just wanted to. This is her 12th year as a master gardener, and she was instrumental in founding both gardens here at Plum Grove, and she can tell you how to become a master gardener if you're interested in doing that.
We usually have the classes starting in September, and you make an application through the county extension office, and then we go over your application. We usually have 2 to 3 times as many applicants as we can take. The student that's picked will take 40 hours of classroom and then contribute 40 hours of volunteer the first year, and then they're required to have 8 hours at least volunteer every year after, and 6 hours of re-education.
And who teaches the classes, or who offers them, and is there a cost for this?
The cost is $50 because that covers the notebook, and who teaches it. A lot of them are taught by personnel, experts from Iowa State in the Department of Agriculture. And we also have a number of films which they use, and the last session is taught in Ames, so they can go to the gardens in Ames and go to the laboratories in Ames and actually see what extension is like.
It sounds like a lot of fun. Is there a limit on the number of people who can take the class? I think you said that, but I want you to say it again.
There is a limit. In Johnson County, we are limited to 15. We do ours in coordination with Lynn County, so both counties are together. That's true of a lot of counties where they double up simply because of the cost of supplying speakers from the university. Yeah.
Thank you. Would you tell us a little bit about the flower garden, which is here?
Okay, the flower garden this is the second year for the flower garden. It's on the site of the second barn, and we find that it's truly on the site of the second barn because the cinders come to the surface quite frequently, and we are gradually amending the soil so it does better. We have, as you come in through, we have the willow wiggle fence, which is a very ancient fence used by a lot of pioneers and a lot of people in this country in the 19th century, simply because it was cheaper. The willow arch over there is a typical old arch that was used, and it's made out of willow branches that are bent. It's 2 years old and stood through the wind. I was out here the next day to make sure that was standing, but I was... we decided to divide the garden up into 4 different sections, A, B, C, and D. One section is devoted to edible and medicinal herbs, which is to my right. Back of that are things that have scent to them, like the woodland tobacco. You can see the clemony, which you can see. Over there are things that are possible to dry and pick, such as the amarist, the globe amarist. And over here, we have cutting flowers, kind that you would take inside and cut, like the zinnias and the cosmos. And they are all garden flowers that would be grown in the middle of the 19th century.
Thank you very much. I know that many, many visitors to Plum Grove have really enjoyed the gardens. And what they don't know, I think, sometimes is that the gardens just keep getting more and more beautiful all year long and really almost kind of reach their peak in September. So I hope people, if they've already seen the garden this year, will come back and see it again because it's just now getting to be wonderful.
I hope they come back and see the morning glories because they're just gorgeous when they're blooming, and today they're all shut up. These are Grandpa Ott's morning glories. They were developed by a pioneer who went through the Civil War and collected a lot of different types of morning glories. So they come from a Civil War veteran. That's why they're called Grandpa Ott's.
Oh, that's really neat. It's too bad it's so overcast today, but I guess we should just be grateful that it's not raining. Thank you, Betty Kelly.
What I'd like to do is just kind of give you a botanical potpourri, that is, things I know about plants that have to do with Plum Grove. And this time of year, which we really are fortunate to have such a beautiful day. At the time of settlement, when the pioneers moved into this area, they found a rather complex variety of vegetation. As they moved from the east towards the west, of course, they were moving to areas that were somewhat drier and moving into what, by the time you get into western Iowa, becomes a great, vast sea of grass, a treeless area. But right in eastern Iowa, though, we had not only upland areas and areas between major rivers, which were seas of grass, that is, prairie, treeless areas. But in addition to those, we had other vegetation types as well. The grassland areas in this part of the state were pretty much confined to upland areas or vast flat areas between the major rivers. The maintenance of grass in eastern Iowa was tied to such things as the regular occurrence of fires. Fires favored the development and growth of grass, and of course they markedly discouraged any of the forest and tree types. So the regular occurrence of fire in an area in eastern Iowa virtually assured that it would be in grassland, that is, prairies. Along the edges of the major grassland areas, there were regions, though, where there was a mixture of grass and fire-resistant trees. And these areas of grass with just a few trees sprinkled through them are what biogeographers refer to as savanna. And parts of eastern Iowa, in fact, parts of what today is Iowa City, were likely to have been savanna areas. In this part of the state, the most fire-resistant of the trees are the bur oaks. And so in these higher, drier areas that weren't burned quite as frequently, they would begin to spread and grow out into the grasslands and create rather park-like environments, environments which early pioneers often referred to as groves. And so you find in Iowa many towns that have names of grove in them, and may well have been some of these savanna bur oak areas where the trees were scattered. Pioneers liked these areas because they were ideal place to build a homestead in the shade, but at the same time you wouldn't have to cut down a whole forest of trees to be able to clear the land and plant it. It's quite likely that in territorial times Plum Grove was in an area that was at least partially savanna. As you move along the topographic high here over onto Summit Street, which gets its name because it is the high point in town, you still find a number of very, very large oaks that predate the settlement of the area. And these are almost invariably bur oaks. And we have a very large one right to our left here. There's another one out on Kirkwood. And then as you go down Summit Street itself, the very largest trees off of Summit Street are some of these sentinel bur oaks that go back prior to the time of settlement. And you can tell from their wide spreading branches that they were growing in open areas then, before any of the land was settled. In areas where you are closer to water sources like Ralston Creek, in areas where there's a little more steep topography, that is, stronger hills, you find an association in which trees became more dominant and prominent in the landscape. Particularly around here, this kind of landscape was dominated by oak and hickories, particularly the white oaks and the shagbark hickories. And we still have remnants of these oak hickory forests in such areas as the cemetery. Oakland Cemetery derives its name, in fact, from the large white oaks that grow there. And the presence of shagbark and other hickories as well. If we get into areas that are even more moist and have a usually more northern exposure, with even less fire intrusion, we find that the oak hickory assemblage gives way to maple basswood, or maple and linden. And you can find that kind of association most easily out in the reservoir area, some of the forested slopes in the adjoining the reservoir. The other major type of vegetation that occurred in this area was down on the floodplains, right down along the rivers itself. And on the river bottoms, you'd find trees like silver maple and river birch and walnut trees, all plants that are adapted for seasonal flooding and do well. Right along the water's edge itself, you would find plants like willow and cottonwood, which actually grow best when they can have their roots right down to the water. So you can see that Iowa at the time of settlement was quite a tapestry of vegetation, and that by moving just a few what equivalents of a few city blocks in one direction or another, you could have changed very much the nature of the vegetation that grew there. I was intrigued by the name of this homestead, that is Plum Grove, and asked if there was any historical information that verified where the name came from. And I guess, unfortunately, there isn't any definitive explanation. It could be that the Lucases were interested in growing fruit trees, among them plums, and certainly there were horticultural varieties of plums available, and I'm certain that along with apple trees and cherry trees, why early pioneers brought plum trees as well. But it's also very likely that the plum that's talked about might have been the native plum, one of the wild plums that grows here in Iowa. And that native plum frequently grows in savanna areas or woodland margins. And this site quite likely fit that bill as well. So the plums of Plum Grove may have well been the native wild plums. The other thing I wanted to talk about before we actually talk about some of the trees around here is what the trees are doing this time of year. That is, what happens to trees in the autumn, in the fall of the year. And of course, it's pretty dramatic what happens to them. First of all, we think of trees generally, and there are of course exceptions, but we think of trees as generally having green leaves. And leaves are green, whether they're tree leaves or grass leaves or garden plant leaves, because the predominant pigment in them is a green pigment, chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is very important in the biological world because it is a unique kind of pigment that not only traps and reflects light, as all pigments do, but is able to enter into a conversion, a biochemical conversion of some of that light energy that the plant can use then to produce its own food, its own sugars. And so chlorophyll is a very essential, not only to plants, but all life, because ultimately all energy, all food comes from this bioconversion. In the spring of the year and in the fall of the year, there is a kind of a general golden cast that comes about if you start looking at the vegetation. In the spring early, just when the leaves are beginning to grow and unfold, there's a kind of a ethereal, almost Italian golden light to the landscape. And we're entering into that season again in the fall. As you look around, many of the trees have a yellowish cast to them. And this yellowing that occurs in the vegetation in the spring and the fall is because the chlorophyll, the green pigment, is not in such predominance. In the spring, it hasn't come into full production yet, and it hasn't covered over some of the yellow pigments that occur in leaves. And in the fall, what happens is that it is no longer, the green pigment is no longer being produced at the same high levels that it is in the summer. It's beginning to fade out, and the yellow pigment that's underneath is beginning to show. The yellow pigments are carotenes, particularly beta-carotene, and that pigment is there all year round. chlorophyll never exists in nature, but what it exists also with this accessory pigment or associated pigment, beta-carotene. In nature, the beta-carotenes probably help screen the chlorophyll molecules from ultraviolet radiation and harm and so forth. So they're essentially a companion pigment that's always there. But in the spring and in the fall, as the chlorophyll level is not so high, you begin to see the yellows peeking out. And so I brought some. This happens to be American elm, but I could just as well have an example of green ash or redbud or walnut, all of which turn a bright yellow as the green chlorophyll pigment is lost and you can see the bright carotenes showing through. So this is part of a very widespread phenomenon of yellowing. Here you can see it happening in a maple. The leaves have gone from green to yellow as well. Sometimes, though, this loss of the chlorophyll is also accompanied by increase of some orange or red pigments. And you can see that's beginning to happen in this. If you look closely at this maple, there's little bits of orange and red appearing. And in some cases, that red can become very bright and very predominant. This is another maple. This is a red maple. You can see the same phenomenon occurring in the hard maple or sugar maples, particularly in some years where there's sunny days like this and cool nights. You can get this beautiful reddish coloration. And this is, again, usually some another one of the carotenes that's beginning to increase its number, its abundance. But not all red in leaves is carotene. Much of it comes from another totally different kind of pigment. Here you can see a leaf of a plant that's commonly called a burning bush or euonymus, winged euonymus shrub. And most of you know that in the fall, this turns, as its name suggests, a very vivid red. And what's happening here is that as the chlorophyll level is decreasing, a different pigment, this is called an anthocyan, it's a water-soluble pigment, a different pigment is being produced and giving it the very, very bright red color. So there's a lot going on in leaves during the fall. The green coloration is being lost, and other pigments, some of which were there all the time and just covered over by the chlorophyll, like the beta-carotenes, become apparent. And then other pigments are being produced in more abundance, things like the anthocyanins, and so you get this extravaganza of color. Another thing, of course, that happens is that the leaves generally fall off, and hence the name we commonly call the season fall. And what happens is that at the base of each leaf petiole, that is this slender stalk that attaches each leaf to the stem, there is a thin layer of cells that develops. This is called the abscission layer. And this thin layer of cells, the cell walls actually break down. That is, they weaken and allow the leaf to fall off. Associated with this abscission layer, there is a thin layer of cork cells that are laid down. And this fall, if you've never done that before, check and see what happens when a leaf falls off of a stem. It leaves a scar. That scar marks the abscission zone, and the surface is covered by this thin layer of cork, and you get a little leaf scar. And almost every type of leaf has its own distinctive scar. That is, each different kind of tree has a leaf scar that's a little different in size and shape and some of the other features. And so some plant taxonomists can actually identify different species and genera of trees just by looking at the winter twigs and looking at the leaf scars and where the buds are attached and what the buds look like. As part of this kind of terminal process of leaf aging, dying, and falling from the trees, somewhere along the line, leaves usually end up turning brown. And what's happening when leaves turn brown, particularly those that have such a beautiful brown color like these oak leaves, is that not only are the pigments like chlorophyll and beta-carotene finally breaking down and being lost, but there are other chemical substances called tannins and that give the leaf this rich brown color. And in fact, it's these tannins then which used to be commercially extracted from things like oak leaves and oak bark and so forth and used to tan leather. Okay? So this rich brown color is a tannin color. Now, not all leaves fall in the fall. Most of them do. Most of them fall prior to frost. Some fall in association with the first frost. If you've ever noticed and have access to a ginkgo tree, ginkgo trees have beautiful butter yellow leaves in the fall, and it seems like they're all up there waiting for that first frost, because the day of after the first frost, they all come tumbling down. But not all leaves come off in the fall. Some, particularly like white oak, stick around regularly until the spring. They remain on the tree until the spring, and it's the enlarging, developing buds in the spring that actually nudge them off. And so those of you that have white oaks in your yard probably have to rake in the spring as well to pick up a crop of oak leaves. Now, I've left time that we can have questions, or we can talk about some of the trees right around Plum Grove itself. Maybe we should start and see if you've got any particular questions.
So is there a ginkgo tree here? Are there bisexual ginkgo trees?
Okay. Ginkgo is one of those plants that sometimes is called a living fossil, because it's a very ancient type of tree that actually was alive and thriving when the dinosaurs were on Earth. In historic times, ginkgos were only native to certain areas in southern China. In other words, during the age of the dinosaurs, it had a very wide distribution, including North America. But as time passed, they became restricted to just parts of southern China. And then with development of trade to China, they were introduced into Europe and then finally back into North America. So the coming of ginkgo trees to the Iowa City area is fairly recent, in the sense that ginkgo has only become a popular ornamental tree, I would say, in the last 40 years or so. I know that there are older specimens, particularly in botanical gardens and so forth in eastern United States and southern United States, but this part of the country, it's rare to find a ginkgo tree that's more than 40 or 50 years old. Ginkgo trees, as in the case of a number of other trees, produce their pollen and their seeds on separate trees. So if you want to have a crop of seeds, then you have to usually plant those two kinds of trees in pretty close proximity, because the pollen is moved around just by the blowing wind. It's not moved by special insect associations. Most people, though, would try to avoid having a ginkgo tree with seeds, because what happens is that the seeds mature in the late summer, and about this time of year, and coming up on the first frost, they will fall off the ginkgo tree. And when they fall off, they begin to ferment, and they have a very strong, and I would say unattractive smell. So, I don't know if there were other parts to your question. There are two kinds of trees, and garden centers and so forth that sell ginkgo trees now usually will guarantee that they're the pollen-producing trees, to save you the mishap of having one of these smelly seed-producing trees in your front yard. And the way that they're able to tell that is that there actually are genetic chromosomal differences. And so they can look at the chromosomes in seedling root tips, or they can grow them from cuttings, because if you take and make a rooted cutting off of a pollen-producing tree, then you're going to get another pollen-producing tree. So, if, on the other hand, you just go to a ginkgo tree that has a bunch of seeds and pick up a bunch of these seeds, although you'll probably be using gloves if it's in the late fall, and plant them, half of the population will turn out to be pollen-producing trees, and half will turn out to be seed-producing trees. So you'd only have a 50-50 chance of avoiding a seed-producing tree if you just grew them from seeds. Okay, the question was shagbark hickories, and how do you get a seedling one? Shagbark hickories are part of a certain class of trees that has a close relationship with squirrels. These include all of the oaks in this area, walnut, butternut, and all of the hickories. You do not find in nature seedling oaks, hickories, and walnuts, but what they have been planted by squirrels. So, of course, squirrels do kind of a messy job of planting, and they don't necessarily plant them where you'd want them. So what you have to do is get ahead of the squirrels and go out and harvest the acorns or the walnuts or the hickory nuts yourself. And at the peak of the season, you know, there are good years and there are bad years for nut trees. Sometimes there's such an abundance of acorns under an oak tree that you can't walk there but what you're roller skating, right? And then other years there's very few. And so what you, in a good year for nuts, go in and collect them and then plant them in a garden or a seed bed, or actually on the site where you want them. Plant several, and then either transplant those seedlings the next year to the site that you want, or better still, having planted them where you want them in the first place, trim out the weaker ones and just save the one that you want to grow. It's very hard to commercially find hickories. They form very deep roots, they're hard to transplant, and they're not an immensely popular tree because many people think of them as messy because they have that shell around the fruit, and they attract squirrels and so forth. So when it comes to hickories, you really have to kind of do the job yourself. And so go to Hickory Hill or around the neighborhood in a good year for hickory nuts and gather up a bunch and plant a bunch. And then put wire over the top so the squirrels don't dig them up for you. Oh, the other part of your question, I'm sorry. On the other end of the scale are trees that are sometimes referred to as weed trees. The really most famous of the weed trees are things like the tree of heaven, and I think I see one over in the fence row there. This is the tree that grows in Brooklyn, you know, out of the sidewalk cracks in Brooklyn. Green ash is another very weedy tree. Elms, to some extent maples. These are plants that produce huge numbers of seeds, and the seeds are wind dispersed. And so what's happening is that thousands and thousands of seeds are getting spread around the countryside, and in a good year, tens of thousands of them will germinate. By a good year, I mean when the rains come at the right time and keep the plants going. And if they're not in some area like your lawn where you're going to mow them off, if they're in a fence row or in a garden bed and so forth, you can rapidly develop a forest of seedlings. And the young plants grow quickly so that in a period of 3 to 4 years, you can have a plant that's now 5, 6 feet tall. redbuds are in that group. They have a pod which has a number of seeds, and if you notice, the pod tends to stay on the tree in the winter. And you wonder, like, well, shouldn't they have dispersed? Well, no, actually, those pods don't fall off until late winter and into spring. And what happens is that they fall off and often fall onto snow and get blown along. They get like little sleds. They get sledded along on the surface of the snow during snowstorms and get spread that way. Sure.
What trees would have been in Iowa 150 or 200 years ago that are not or are rare now?
Well, some trees, by their very nature, are not abundant in any given locality. Other trees once were very abundant in some localities, but those localities have either been destroyed in the settlement process or the trees have fallen victim to some disease. And of course, all of us in our own lifetime are sadly aware of what's happened to the American elms. So certainly, that's a tree which grew, particularly floodplains areas through Iowa, was very abundant, then adopted by cities as the kind of preferred street tree because of their magnificent height and shape and shade. And I'm sure you all can remember absolutely breathtaking avenues in virtually every town in Iowa that have now been lost, although there still are some large elms, American elms, still struggling on. So that's one very abundant example. I don't think any of us are old enough here to remember the American chestnut, but that was a tree not so much in Iowa, it didn't come this far west, but in the Appalachian areas and into Ohio and so forth. A magnificent tree, a huge tree, a very abundant and important tree, which also fell victim to another disease. As far as I know, cottonwoods are still going hale and hearty. There are any number of diseases, oak wilt and verticillium wilt, and I hate to go on and on. There's none of which are quite as decimating and thorough as either the Dutch elm disease or the chestnut blight. But trees are fighters. They usually put up a pretty good fight. One of the problems with common names is that the same name can be used for different trees. Around Iowa City, what most people call chestnut is a plant that has a compound leaf, sort of like this, you know, a five-parted large leaf, and then a rather attractive brown, shiny nut. That's the horse chestnut, okay? And although the name sounds very similar, it's not the same plant. The only, and then there's a European chestnut. There are a few trees in Iowa, too. Both of those, though, the leaves turn bright yellow in the fall. That's the most common, if you think about it, that's the most common color that leaves turn in the fall, because that's what happens. Once you get rid of the chlorophyll in any leaf, you've still got the beta-carotene. So any leaf at least has the potential of being a yellow leaf, and will stay yellow unless that yellow color is masked with one of the red colors. The horse chestnuts tend to develop a late summer leaf blight, and that often drives them for the leaves to turn brown and crinkly early on. That's not unique either. As you look around to some of the crab apples and hawthorns around us here, they're looking pretty poorly And that's common for many varieties of crab apples and hawthorns to develop a leaf blight, although it's a different one than the horse chestnuts do, and lose their leaves early in a blight year. Then there's blights, leaf blights that occur in the spring. Sycamore trees around Iowa City, for example, some years they have a terrible time getting a crop of leaves in the spring because the leaves start to open and then they get a leaf blight and they're gone, and they'll try again, and if it's still rainy weather they may lose the second crop, but eventually they'll get a crop of leaves. Well, one thing we can do is we don't really have to get up. Trees are big enough that we can see them from where we are, so we don't have to walk if we don't want to. Let me just point out this large oak tree of which a branch has recently come down in the storm, which is kind of interesting because if you do get up and take a look carefully at the tree later, you'll see that this isn't the first time that tree has been subject to a lot of storm damage. Up there where that squirrel is sitting and just coming down now, there's a large scar, several feet across, of where approximately a branch as large as is up there now broke out. In other words, the crown some years ago split and about half the tree fell down, and some new branches have come out there on the right that are kind of filling in. So some trees, like bur oaks, for example, are, as I say, fighters. They can go through a lot of damage and still survive. We have a number of walnut trees around. Oh, by the way, behind me, you can see this tree and this one are young bur oaks that have been planted. So it's nice to see that who's ever handling the landscaping here is trying to plant trees that are appropriate and would have been here, say, at territorial times. So there's a very old bur oak, and here's some younger ones coming along. We have the other large tree there is a silver maple. And a silver maple is a native tree. It would have been growing on the floodplain, and of course, you only know we have to go just a couple of city blocks here, and you're down on the floodplain. So it's only a little bit out of its usual habitat. They're very rapidly growing trees. So while an oak tree, a bur oak that size, is certainly more than 100 years old and maybe closer to 200 years old, a silver maple, which has even a larger trunk around it, isn't that old. I would be surprised that silver maple is more than 65 or 70 years at the most. So some trees, like silver maples and cottonwoods, grow very rapidly, grow to be tremendously large trees, but then, by the time you're 100 years old, they're very old and almost invariably are damaged by wind and storm and ice loading and split. So that's silver maple, and it's called silver maple because if you've never noticed, the backside of the leaves have a kind of a whitish or silvery cast, which is particularly prominent when the wind is blowing and shaking them. As we come around up onto this side, we have a little grove of cedar trees, red cedar. Now those also are a native tree. They're one of the few evergreens or conifers that natively grows in Iowa. And most of you, if you think about it, realize that the Cedar River and Cedar Rapids and Cedar Falls are all named after that kind of tree. In the natural scheme of things, that tree grows in what are called escarpment areas, that is, the rocky bluffs that are along steep river banks. And so it's not surprising then that the Cedar River got its name because it has those rocky bluffs which become home then to the cedar trees. They may not seem very presupposing, that is, they look fairly small and slightly scruffy when compared to something like a blue spruce, which has such a perfect shape and coloration. But they also are a very tough tree. In fact, among the very oldest trees in Iowa are some red cedars, some of which are as much as 400 years old, clinging to these rocky bluffs along rivers in Iowa. They also have a very distinctive wood. Most of you know that cedar chests and cedar closets are lined with wood, mostly from this red cedar, and that if you cut down into the heart of one of these trees, it has a reddish, almost lavender color and a very pungent smell to it. And it's that pungent smell then that's used, that lumber is used then to discourage moth and other things from getting at woolens and so forth in these closets. They also end up being in hamster cages and guinea pig cages to kind of abate the smell there as well. Pioneers particularly treasured them for use as fence posts or any kind of lumber that had to be sunk in the ground. I've seen cedar fence posts that have been in the ground for 90 years and are still firm, still haven't rotted out. So particularly if it's the heartwood, that purple wood in the center, has a lot of resinous material in it that discourages wood rot. So those are a number of trees. We also, on this side of the house, have a number of walnut trees, and there's some interesting varieties there. Obviously, someone took some time to bring over, there's at least one tree that has unusually large walnuts. So if you're a walnut aficionado, why, you might beat the squirrels to some of those there and carry some back and plant them yourself, or eat them yourself, I'm sure. Of course, they're messy, right? Walnuts were treasured by early pioneers, not only for their food value, but for the lovely lumber. The heartwood of the walnut tree has a very beautiful dark coloration to it, and was very suitable for furniture, although in pioneer times it was also used for floor joists and anything else, because it's a wood that's fairly easily worked and has usually a nice straight grain, unless it is what occurs in some galls. Some walnut trees and some oak trees have these bumpy growths on their surface. This is when the tree becomes infected with various kinds of parasites, and the wood responds to the presence of that parasites by growing in a very convoluted manner. This produces then that lump or burl, which, if it's very carefully sliced, gives you the beautiful grain that one can see in certain walnut and oak veneer late Victorian furniture, which has all that beautiful eyed grain in it. Well, are there any other questions? If not, that really concludes all the comments that